Hello, and welcome to KansasFest A24eVR 2023. The theme this year is the Apple III, and so I am going to spend a little bit of time here just introducing you to the Apple III. This is Intro to 3, or the Apple III is way better than you have been led to believe. So in 1979, Apple started feeling like the Apple II was getting old and it wasn't going to sell forever, and they needed to get a new product out. And so they put the Apple III together and released it in November 1980. It was sort of an evolution of the Apple II. So it bundled together a lot of common options that a business user might want. So more memory, faster processor, communications, printing, 80 columns, a clock, RGB video, built-in disk drive, numeric keypad. It was expensive, but it was comparable in price to an Apple II that had all those things added to it. The case design, it's got this sort of strange separated keyboard that isn't actually separated, but it kind of looks like it might be removed. And it's got a built-in disk drive there. It has a nice angled front for propping papers on. In the back, there are these fins, which, they're stylish, but they also are kind of a heat, passive heat dissipation mechanism. On the back, there are a bunch of ports built in. So there's a floppy port, 2 ports for joysticks, one of which you can use for the printer. There's a color video port, and then a composite out and an audio port, and communications RS-232 port. There are 4 slots on the board, and you can put, cards like you put them in an Apple II. You can put them in the Apple III. And in fact, they're electrically compatible. The size is a little different. So not all Apple II cards will fit in an Apple III. But if the card fits, it's electrically compatible. And so you could conceivably use an Apple II card in an Apple III. The top case is plastic. So when you lift it off, you see what I've got the image of here, which is a very sort of industrial, metal case. So the power supply is here on the left. The internal disk drive is there on the right. The speaker, and then you can see a little bit of the logic board through this hole. The whole thing was kind of blocked off pretty tightly in order to try to minimize RF interference. They weren't sure what the FCC was going to require, and they just wanted to be sure. Okay, the designer of the machine was Wendell Sander. He was sort of in charge of the project, and internally the machine was known as Sarah, which is named after Wendell's daughter. He tried to get a lot of stuff on this board, and it was a pretty tight layout. In order to get everything to fit, the RAM itself was displaced onto a daughter board that attaches on a row of pins on each side. So if you look at the logic board here, you can see these pins here on the left and the right, many pins, and then this daughter board RAM slides on top of it. It's fairly tight. Anyway, okay, so the another thing that the Apple III contributed was the Monitor 3 on the profile. So the Monitor 3 was designed, it's a slow monochrome monitor and designed to fit on the Apple III. It has a sort of a nice mesh glare guard, and it turns out that the monitor was good enough that it became very popular with the Apple II as well. So you could often find Apple IIs with this little shelf to simulate the top of an Apple III on which a Monitor 3 would be. So school systems often would have labs full of these things. Also the profile, the 5 megabyte or 10 megabyte hard drive, that was designed for the Apple III fairly clearly. You often will see them sitting atop a Lisa, but of course that looks ridiculous. The profile is designed for the Apple III and fits quite nicely there. In terms of what was in the sort of built into the machine, the Apple II has quite a lot in ROM, and the Apple III does not. So the Apple II has machine language monitor and basic and I/O routines. It is able to find a mass storage card and boot from it. And the Apple III basically just loads everything off disk. So it has very little in ROM. It's just enough to do the startup diagnostics and then boot from the built-in floppy. The problem with that is that it does rely on the internal disk drive, so it can't boot from anything but the internal disk drive. Also, the startup diagnostic checks, one of the things it checks for is to make sure that the keyboard is plugged in. But the way the test works is essentially it's testing whether the power light is sensed, which means that, oddly, if the power light burns out. The self-test fails. So that's another sort of quirk of the Apple III. The Apple III is faster, but it shares the video architecture with the Apple II, and so it has to, whenever it's displaying video, it has to be running at 1 megahertz speed. So at that time, whenever it's displaying video, it's running at 1 megahertz speed, and then at every other time, it shifts up to 2 megahertz. So horizontal blanks, vertical blanks, anytime the video's off, it is up at 2 megahertz, and so it's shifting speeds constantly. The Apple III does have color. This is something you might not have known if you'd only seen pictures of people running VisiCalc, but there is a monitor that was sort of designed for it. It was Apple's first color monitor, RGB monitor, called the Apple Color Monitor 100. It plugs right into the port on the back, and it was actually introduced a little bit late. It was introduced in 1984, which is several years after the 3 was actually out. But it has, as far as graphics capabilities, it has new display modes. It has a 16 color 140 by 192 graphics, high-res black and white of 560 by 192. It has color text, so you can have text with a foreground and a background color. It has customizable fonts, so you can change what the font is like. And in fact, actually, the one thing that allows for is animation with fonts. So if you upload a font with graphics in them, and then just change the text page, which isn't very many bytes to change, you can do fairly sophisticated looking animation. So here in the corner, I've got Andy Hertzfeld's Running Horses demo, one of the famous things that the Apple III can do, which it looks like it's moving an incredible number of pixels, but in fact that's just text. It's just a text a font with horse parts. The other thing it has a nice interrupt system, so it can detect vertical blanking, horizontal blanking, and there's one kind of unique thing about the Apple III is it has this smooth scrolling capability, which allows you to, if you're scrolling vertically, it allows this to be done in about an eighth of the time that it would normally take on an Apple II. Another thing that the Apple III has is the ability to have a lot more memory. Of course, the Apple II, there were memory cards for the Apple II that could boost its memory higher. Most of them on the Apple II used bank swapping. So the idea is that there's some region in memory, and you just tell the Apple which part of the larger memory you want to swap into that addressable region. So on the Apple III, you can do that. The region between 2000 and 9 FFF is banked, and so you pick a 32K bank and put it in there. But that's sort of clumsy if you want to copy something from one bank to another. There's a more interesting thing that Wendell Sander came up with, which is using 11-bit addresses. So the Apple III always reads 2 bytes at once, the one you asked for, and then a second sort of phantom read from an offset address. And the reason it's doing that is so that it can do 80-column text. It retrieves text from page 1 and page 2 simultaneously, and then interleaves them. But Sander leveraged this in order to provide 3 extra bits for the bank address. And so the Apple III watches the CPU on the fly as it's executing, and for a few specific instructions, it checks that phantom read and then retrieves the part of RAM that it points to. So if you do an indirect, like a load accumulator from indirect 20, Y, it will read the byte that 2021 points to, offset by Y, but from the bank specified in 1621, more or less. That's essentially how it works. The operating system, SOS, was originally Sarah's operating system, but it was later retconned to Sophisticated Operating System. It's very modular. All the hardware interaction is mediated by device drivers. It has hierarchical directories, and it's compatible with ProDOS. So ProDOS adopted the SOS file system, and so SOS and ProDOS disks can read and write each other. Obviously, the other parts of the operating system are not the same, but the file system is the same. The Apple III had a clock. It had a real-time clock, and SOS knows how to use it. But it turned out that really at the last second, actually just past the last second, the clock chip, had availability and reliability concerns, and there was no second source for the chip. So they eventually just pulled the clock out and sold it without the clock. You could have some service person install one for you. So all the circuits were still there, but they had to they couldn't trust the chips that they were getting, so they took that out. If you know only one thing about the Apple III, then probably the thing you know is that when it didn't work, the recommendation was to pick it up and drop it. And if they know sort of a second related thing, it's that what happens when you drop it is that the chips that had kind of walked out due to heat cycling or something would reseat themselves, and then it would work. And I will just note that that's obviously ridiculous. If you've ever pushed a chip into a socket with your finger, it's going to be clear that if you drop the board however many times and however far you drop it, it's not going to magically push these light little chips into those tight sockets. But there was something that was a real issue, and dropping the machine did fix. So the machine would start to freeze after a while, the original ones, and dropping it did seem to solve it. And the problem was that that RAM daughter board, the connections to it would oxidize quickly, and then then they would not be able to communicate with the RAM, and it would freeze. But if you jolt it, if you drop the machine and jolt the daughter board, that will sort of free it from the oxidized connections and reestablish a connection to RAM. So this was solved overall with just a better RAM connector. They used a double contact and tighter connector. They recalled all the original machines up to serial number 14,000 and replaced them for free, which means that actually it's almost impossible to find one of these broken first-run Apple IIIs, almost as impossible as it is to find an Apple I or a Lisa I, because they were replaced for free, so everybody did that. So if you get an Apple III, it's near certain to be the fixed one. A third thing that people know is that the Apple III was a flop, and that's sort of true, but it's not really due to the machine being badly designed, but more about Apple handling its post-design stage. Most of the people who had their machines replaced for free were actually pretty loyal, because Apple had taken good care of them. But the biggest issues were lack of software, marketing incoherence, and then company internal pressures to stop doing anything that might compete with Focus on the Mac. Developers were not really encouraged. The reference manuals and the programming languages were very slow to come out. And the Apple III can emulate an Apple II, a 48K Apple II Plus, but there's only sort of a limited range of software by 1980 that would work on that platform. And one note about that is that the Apple II emulation mode could have been improved to be sort of like more than a 48K Apple II Plus, except that it wouldn't have been easy or quick. So the 48K Apple II Plus was simple. It was almost free. It didn't require any bank switching. It could be done quite easily. Anything else would require significant engineering. The Apple III was actually pretty profitable. The margins were good, even if the units sold weren't as high as the Apple II. The FCC ruled that it was too noisy, and it forced discontinuation in October 1983. They released an Apple III Plus in December 1983 that solved the RF issues and also improved the keyboard and the drive connector and added a video interlace switch. But it was pulled from the catalog in April 1984, like 5 months later. It basically never got a chance. The other thing I wanted to do is introduce the people that we'll be talking with. So we'll be talking with Bob Consorti during the virtual event. Bob founded the magazine and company On3. On3 was formed after the Apple III was already discontinued, and it was a fantastic magazine and support company for the existing Apple III community with technical articles and tips and reviews and software like drivers and graphics, games, application launchers, hardware like a 512K RAM upgrade board. It's definitely one of the most active companies keeping people productive with their Apple IIIs all the way into the middle 1990s. We'll also talk with Dave Ottolini, longtime chair of the Apple III Special Interest Group of the Washington Apple Pie User Group. The Washington Apple Pie 3 SIG curated a huge collection of public domain software and documentation and training videos for the Apple III and made them available to the community. Also lobbied the authors to put their software and stuff into the public domain after the sales stopped. So it's still one of the best resources for Apple III software out there. And they even commissioned an update to SOS in the early 1990s from Bob Consorti called Bob's operating system. So that's kind of the most current Apple III operating system. Anyway, that's the Apple III in a brief, condensed nutshell. And so, enjoy the rest of the event.